I call upon the first speaker to introduce the proposition case for 8 minutes.
Let's start off by talking about instability. So what comes to mind when we think of instability? Maybe do you conjure up an idea of militia in the backyard of a family's home? A destitute economy? Immense unlikelihood of social services? A step out the door is a threat in and of itself. And this is precisely what we are trying to change. Good afternoon. The resolution before the House today is this House prefers stability to democracy in the Arab world, and we on Side Proposition strongly believe that this must stand. But before I delve into Side Proposition's constructive case, let's take a look at the definitions for debate today. Firstly, this House is the United Nations General Assembly. Stability is government-maintained civil and social order as well as economic prosperity. Democracy is a form of government in which elections determine the political leaders. And finally, the Arab world is referring to the 22 members of the Arab League, geographically including Northern Africa and the Arab Peninsula. Yes, sir?
From your definitions, are you assuming that the UN is going to impose stability on the Middle East?
No, it's not going to be a sense of imposing at all. We're simply going to be looking at what's going to be best for the countries of the Arab world, and I'll get into that as again to our constructive case. But let's outline that first. So first we have the benefits of stability. Secondly, we have examples of this in real life. And lastly, we have why democracy is unsuitable. And I'll talk about these first two contentions, and my partner will get into this third contention. But let's talk about, the benefits of stability. Now, stability has plenty of merits and has a lot to offer. And as my partner will explain later on, stability is something that will work for every country in the Arab world instead of this blanket solution of democracy. But what kind of benefits are we talking about? According to an article from the Huffington Post, the international community's ties with the Arab world have significantly deteriorated with the events of the Arab Spring and the subsequent instability. But of course there are always exceptions, but what are these exceptions? And the one country that has benefited in particular is Russia. And how have they benefited? Their arms and weapon sales have dramatically increased as they fund the violence on the side of the government over this dispute. Russia has extended its hand to Iran and Syria, and since Syria falls under this definition of the Arab world, let's take a look at that nation. Anyone who has ever glanced at the cover of Time magazine, seen a headline on CNN, has heard of the atrocities committed in Syria over the past few months. We see chemical weapons in Damascus, over 100,000 dead, and we see also 2 million have fled. And not only do we see the harms of instability physically, but we also see neighboring countries such as Egypt and Jordan unable to cope with the amount of refugees coming in. Yes, sir?
All right, if not democracy, could Side Proposition clarify what type of government they would want in the Arab world to achieve this stability?
Well, the type of government we would be looking at is whatever is best suited for that country. You see, not every country in the Arab world wants democracy, and my partner will explain this a little bit later on. This could be anything from a monarchy, authoritarian, totalitarian, whatever is going to bring about stability. Because this is a more theoretical debate, we do not feel the need to delve into each of these 22 countries and pick a certain government. We're not looking to impose values. But once we look at the fact that instability is simply causing a lack of safety for the civilians in these countries, we see that we simply cannot prolong it. And so we also look at the fact that the Arab Spring has proven to be a net negative in terms of these countries looking to choose democracy. And the people as well as the economies of these impacted countries are suffering. But let's get into this idea of the economy. And it's nearly impossible to ignore considering the Middle East accounts for about 1/3 of oil exports in the entire world. And we simply cannot account for the fact that with instability, the economic strength is not there. We have economic instability, and not only are the countries suffering, but the international community as well. Countries in transition, particularly those experiencing social unrest such as Egypt, Jordan, Libya, are experiencing an economic downturn. In the words of the International Monetary Fund, political instability reduces gross domestic profit rates significantly. And we on Side Proposition do not want to perpetuate this instability in the economy. It's also imperative to note that a government that is busy developing a new form of government style, such as democracy, as Side Opposition would have it, is hardly in a position to maintain control of the economy, of oil production, etc. So what does this mean for the people? It means with economic instability comes more poverty. We see quality of life going down. And these are facts that are simply irrefutable. We see that from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, all of these GDPs, gross domestic profits, are going down. We want them to go up, do we not? You can't say you would ask any civilian of the Arab world and say, hey, would you like increased safety and GDP? And they would say no. Simply isn't feasible. And that's what we on Side Proposition are offering today. And so it's completely clear that instability isn't safe for the people of the Arab world. But let's look at where stability can exist without having to put a democracy in place and impose those types of values. Now, Saudi Arabia is essentially a monarchy. The king serves as the prime minister, chief of state, head of government, head of the army, etc. And since the position is hereditary, obviously there's no choice in who is going to be that leader. But Saudi Arabia isn't unstable. Their people aren't dying. Their people aren't fleeing. And what we see is that because the legal system of Saudi Arabia is very similar to that of other Arab nations, that this can serve as a model for the rest of the Arab world. Yes, sir?
Yeah, would you recognize that in Saudi Arabia, the monarch has considerable influence over judicial systems, has stacked his friends and allies into courts, which makes him above the law and immune to crimes? How is that beneficial?
Well, we're not saying that, this idea of rule of law has to be in effect, though, either. That's nowhere in this resolution. What we are looking at is putting the infrastructure, the time, the money into place so that if the people decide they want democracy later on, it's not going to collapse, and we still have this sense of stability. Now, we on Side Proposition are looking at the short term. We're looking at the present situation. And in the current situation of the Arab world, you know what's best? Stability. And that is what the people need and what the people want. So if we take a look back at Saudi Arabia, we see that the king appoints a council, and there are women on this council. And there was recently a law passed that stated that women must constitute at least 20% of this council that advises the king on issues relevant to the entire nation. And so what does this mean when we're looking at stability? It means that stability can exist and it can help the people of the nation and still have a regard for human rights, equality. And so even though our opponents seem to bring up the idea of, rule of law, people being above it, we see steps being made toward that even without democracy. So what has Side Proposition brought to you thus far? Now, we've showed you our first contention, the benefits of stability, and the fact that with stability comes more safety, economic improvement, instead of continuing to diminish in terms of investor confidence, GDP, and all sorts of other stats, no matter how you calculate the numbers. We've also seen through the example of Saudi Arabia that this is feasible. And as my partner will explain, democracy is an unsuitable solution for the entire Arab world, and that is why we stand proud to propose. Thank you.